The Dark Ages was full of things that in today's day and age make little to no sense. Welcome back to Bumblebee. I'm your stand-in host Dayna, and today I have for you the top 10 Dark Age laws that make no sense. At number 10, we have blowing your nose in public. We are starting off strong because this was far more absurd than even I could imagine. For it to make sense, we have to start from the beginning. In 12th century Newmarket, horse racing made its debut, but didn't become popular until the 16th century, which is when it really started to gain traction. And that was when many laws surrounding horses were put in place. In Newmarket particularly, it became really big for business. So there were lots of horses and they needed to be protected in order for them to race properly at full health. One of the laws that was put in place was being unable to blow your nose in public because they didn't want the horses getting sick. Not only was it blowing your nose, but if you exhibited any other symptoms of illness while in public, it could have resulted in mild trouble or a fine. They did not mess around with their horse's health. At number 9, we have the ordeals. Punishment in the Dark Ages, whether it be non-consensual chiropractics on the stretcher or a hot pail and a couple of rats, it was seriously concerning. Well, up until 1215, if peasants were accused of a crime, they would have to go through an ordeal to prove their innocence. There were 3 different types of ordeals. There was ordeal by fire, where a person would carry a burning hot rod for 3 meters, then their wounds would be bandaged. They would sit and wait for 3 days, with the wound still bandaged, and when the bandage was removed, the state of the burn would determine whether or not they were innocent. If the burn was healing, they were innocent, and if they weren't healing, they were guilty. There was ordeal by water, which is where the accused person would be thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were innocent, and if they didn't, they were guilty. The third ordeal was combat, where they would literally fight to prove their innocence, and if they didn't complete the trial, they were guilty. It was in 1215 where the jury system was introduced, which was far more humane, considering there was a lot of flaws in the ordeal process. At number 8, we have entering the House of Parliament armed. This practice began in the 13th century and was actually never abolished, so it is technically still active to this day. What happened was that Edward II had made a lot of people he was ruling very angry. So to avoid a peasant uprising with weapons and armor, and other things he couldn't fight back against himself, he enforced the law of being unable to enter the Parliament building in armor or while armed, because that was considered a threat to a higher-up, and was a punishable offense. It was also punishable to enter the Parliament building using force. So while the law itself has some logic behind it, it was put in place for all the wrong reasons, to protect a tyrant of a ruler, which makes no sense. At number 7, we have eating more than 2 courses. This one also has some logic to it, but still really makes no sense. In the Dark Ages, there were a lot of laws in place that determined what lower class townsfolk could and couldn't eat. This was put into place so the lower class couldn't resemble or live as lavishly as the upper class and royalty. It began in the mid-13th century and wasn't repealed until the mid-18th century. What the punishment was unclear, and there are no documented punishments for the act, but it was heavily frowned upon. The details of the law were that a regular man could not eat an excessive amount of meats and dishes that nobles were eating. A man must be limited to 2 dishes, with the exceptions for holidays like Christmas, where they were allowed to have 3 courses. Something else to note is that soup was considered a full course meal and not just a sauce. So if you were having soup, you had to choose your second course wisely. Thankfully, we don't have any laws like that today, because that would make family events really awkward. At number 6, we have scheduled baby making. Fornication is part of a human's animal nature. It's how we all came to be. But in the Dark Ages, there were only specific and dedicated times when a couple was allowed to go at it, because of religious laws. They were only allowed to do the deed on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday because they were required to start preparing for the church services on Sunday on Thursday. Saturday, it was allowed as well, but not everyone participated on the day because it was the in-between the preparation and the Lord's Day. Throughout the year, there were other lengths of time where it wasn't allowed, like the 47 to 62 days of Lent, which is in the spring, and the 35 days leading up to Christmas, December 25th, and the 40 to 60 days around the time of the Feast of the Pentecost. To make matters worse, women were not allowed to make eye contact with their husbands, or any other man for that matter, during these times, because eye contact was believed perceived to be a temptation and was frowned upon during times when no action could be taken. And if she was caught making eye contact, she would have been punished for it, which in reality also makes no sense. At number 5, we have hunting royal game. This goes for hunting the king's deer and catching the king's fish. It started with the deer in the late 11th century. What made it more difficult was after the conquests of England, a lot of local land was deemed royal land, and locals were not allowed to hunt on it and would be punished if they took one of the king's deer. The punishment for this was to be blinded or worse. It was repealed in the early 12th century. As for the fish, the laws were put in place in the 13th century and were never abolished, except it was slightly different. There was no set punishment for catching the whales and sturgeons, but if they were washed up on shore, they were to be offered to the monarchs first before the locals were allowed to have it. Nowadays, it makes no sense because many other laws in place override it. But in 2004, a Welsh fisherman caught a sturgeon and offered it to the Queen. Just an interesting fun fact for you. At number 4, we have having your tongue removed. Some people like to spread rumors or talk trash behind others' backs, or even make up things for theatrical effect. Well, in the Dark Ages, you could have your tongue removed from your mouth for spreading misinformation or using the Lord's name in vain. The church viewed blasphemy as a very severe crime, considering the church ruled just about everything, alongside the monarchs at the time. So if you were caught spreading a belief that did not align with the church, you would be punished. So removing the tongue would leave the convict mute for the rest of their lives, therefore sufficing for the crimes. They would also be stoned or left in rope for the crimes depending on how long they were committing said blasphemy, as well as the context of the information. Just another example of medieval control tactics which in today's world make no sense. At number 3, we have what was deemed indecent dress. In the mid-14th century, wearing long and overly pointy shoes that were longer depending on your social status and could extend up to 5 inches off the foot, as well as eccentric and flamboyant tunics, were considered illegal for the lower class. How did this come to be? As the fashion trends began to become popular amongst peasants, the crown stepped in, saying they were no longer allowed to participate in the fashion trends. This was to preserve the rich and famous image, and how only the wealthy were allowed to wear such extravagant clothing. It was deemed that no townsfolk with a rank lower than a knight or a noble was allowed to wear shoes with spikes or a toe that extended more than 2 inches. And the same went for top clothing. No local was allowed to wear clothing that was deemed indecent, and it had to cover most of them, whereas lords, nobles, and royalty were allowed to wear clothing that was far more revealing. It makes no sense because it was another excuse to separate people. Thankfully, it was repealed in the early 16th century, and people were allowed to dress as they deemed necessary because putting a cap on a shoe length is just silly. At number 2, we have the amount that was punishable by offing. In the Dark Ages, just about any crime was severe enough that you could lose your life over it. It was also far harder for women because they had to be far more cautious about what they say, how they acted, and what they knew. There was a lot of women who were stoned or burned for having moles that were deemed too large to be human, or for having birthmarks that were immediately noticeable. They would also be offed for being able to read, being able to understand math, being old and having a cat, and simply existing because they were witches and they were the reason the entire town was down on their luck. And that's just women. Talking back to royalty was punishable by meeting the end, and a lot of their methods to get people to confess or regret their crimes led to meeting their very unfortunate demise. It was really unethical and doesn't really make much sense in the grand scheme of things. And last but not least, at number 1, we have playing tennis and soccer was forbidden. Football, or soccer, was banned in the late 13th century because it was deemed to be too violent, considering fatalities while playing was a common occurrence. The games would get very aggressive and would often break out in fights as well, which, while that aspect is similar to today's soccer, it was very different from the soccer/football we know today. It was originally banned in England in order to keep the peace while Edward II was in Scotland. Then it was banned nationally towards the end of the 13th century. As an alternative, the locals were encouraged to practice archery, so they had some sort of method of defense when other countries would attempt to invade. If you were caught playing football, you spent 6 days in prison for the crime, but that would be the extent of the punishment. As for tennis, in the late 14th century, it became illegal for any man who wasn't a noble of some sort to play tennis because it was deemed a royal sport, and it encouraged gambling amongst lower class citizens and caused men to slack off their work, which was a problem. The law was once again put in place to separate the lower class from the upper class, and the only exception to the law was Christmas, when regular people were allowed to play tennis with the nobles. Thankfully, both of these laws were repealed in the 18th century, and the sports were once again encouraged. And that has been our list for today. If you liked this video, you can leave a like or a comment down below, and if you're interested in more Dark Age content, you should check out the channel. I have been your stand-in host Dayna, and thank you for tuning in to Bumblebee.